Remember, because we were kind of the girl next door image type. All of that image was to present, I suppose, from Piedmont, a new way that was very of the times. You were supposed to be the lady, and that was the representation they wanted.
You never did not look unprepared. Even when we would get to our stops, we'd put on our white gloves, and we would tell our passengers goodbye. Never changed from your high heel shoes.
The service was really emphasized because you didn't have a lot of extras to serve the passenger.
We just felt like that the girls gave us an image of what big airlines were like. It was just another avenue to say, you know, hey guys, we have arrived and we're playing with the big boys now.
Expansion continued for the Speedbird as it reached beyond the Southeast. Modernization helped employees stay ahead of demand. As Piedmont grew, it was also unfortunately subjected to the same kinds of pitfalls that plagued other airlines. 4 tragic accidents occurred, the first on Halloween night, 1959.
The DC-3 accident, that was, of course, the first one that we had, and of course, you went for a couple of days before the airplane was found, so we were all, you know, just on the edge of our seats.
We like to never found it. We drove all Saturday night and finally found it Sunday morning.
Dense foliage near the top of Buck's Elbow Mountain on the eastern face of the Blue Ridge in Virginia hid the wreckage from rescuers for 35 hours. When discovered, only 1 passenger was miraculously still alive. As with every crash of a Piedmont Airlines plane, mechanical problems were never found to be the cause.
At that time, there were no cockpit voice recorders or flight data recorders, and so maintenance had to prove everything. Was the power on the engines? Was everything functioning? Did you have hydraulics, electrical, radio, all the way down the line? Each one of those items had to be totally covered and proved to the CAB. NTSB didn't exist at this time.
We never could decide what actually caused that accident. Frank Nicholson and I took a DC-3 up, and I guess we made 100 approaches, trying different things to see what happened on it. And we finally came to the conclusion that there was a homing beacon, but there was another homing beacon up in northern Pennsylvania, as you know, it skipped sometimes, because this boy flew a perfect pattern, moved over about 8 miles. He was doing what he's supposed to do, but he was just the wrong place over it. And the only reason he got over there, he was getting a false reading on the ADF is the only reason we could figure he could be over there.
It's pretty tough at a small company, and when you have a dramatic type of accident like that one in Virginia, one of those headline-making accidents.
They took it personally. And I think that's what you really say about Piedmont in general, is that everybody took it very personally.
In late 1966, a flight crew ferrying a plane from Wilmington, North Carolina, went down on the approach to nearby New Bern.
The one in New Bern, of course, that was just the loss of the flight crew, which was bad enough, but thank God we didn't have any passengers on that airplane. There's no accident that's a good accident, you know, they're all terrible.
He had a new co-pilot. The boy flying it was named Joe Helsebach, and real experienced. The co-pilot was a boy that was just hard. I think this was his first or second trip. A new boy, and he shouldn't have trusted him to make an approach.
Less than a year later came perhaps the most alarming loss to the airline. A newly leased Boeing 727 jet took off from the airport in Asheville, North Carolina. As it made the turn to head for Roanoke, Virginia, a small private plane, a Cessna, smashed into the Manhattan pacemaker underneath the captain's window. Both planes fell to the ground. There were no survivors. The crash drew national attention, in part because one of the 84 casualties was Secretary of Defense designate John McNaughton.
That was pretty traumatic a time for all of us, mainly because we knew the flight crews. Ray Schulte, the captain that was on the airplane, was one of the first pilots with the company. Everybody knew Ray Schulte, so it was a blow for that in itself. And it was a blow to others of us personally.
As I approached the airport the tower cleared the jet for takeoff. Shortly thereafter, there was quite a bit of smoke coming up from the south, and the tower was trying to contact Flight 22, and there was no response. And I told them that as soon as the passengers deplaned off of the flight I was flying, I would go to the site and check it out and see what was there. And I identified the blue Piedmont paint on the vertical stabilizer of the 727.
I went to the crash site the following morning, and the cockpit structure of the airplane had not been removed at the time, so the flight crew was still there. But when I walked onto that scene, and knowing full well that the flight crew was still there, I guess I bawled like a baby.
The Cessna thought that he would just break out and see the airport, not realizing that he had not followed the instructions that he had been given by approach control. And therefore, he ended up where he shouldn't be. And of course, with the tower not knowing he was in that area, released the jet, and the incident occurred because the Cessna was not following the clearance he was given.
It was really tough to deal with. It was the worst 2 weeks of my life, having to go through that, and it really worked on everybody, especially those of us that were there at the scene. It was things you just can't forget.
The last crash of a Piedmont Airlines plane came in July of 1968. Flight 230 hit the mountainous slope just in front of the runway on its approach to the Charleston, West Virginia airport. Captain Gene Sugg and his crew were killed along with 35 of the 37 passengers on board.
Being, say, this high, and you could see the runway, and you had to go through a little bit of fog to get on the runway. Got too low. Got disorientated for just a second there, and if he would have been 6 feet higher, he'd hit on the runway and landed.
When emergencies arose, Piedmont pilots largely avoided catastrophe by relying on the extensive education they had received back in Winston-Salem from a training department that emphasized preparation while leading the industry in ground school instruction.
Well, the kind of unique thing about Piedmont is they had mechanics as instructors in the ground school. And what those guys did is they taught you how to build the airplane. And the reason they did that, they wanted you to have the nuts and bolts to it. So if you did have a problem, you'd have a good working knowledge of what system was doing what, and back and forth like that. And it worked out pretty good.
Piedmont employees felt it was their responsibility to improve the airline where they could. With each successive year, old hands welcomed new employees to the company. In 1966, Warren Wheeler stepped into the cockpit as Piedmont's first African-American pilot. Cheryl Ritchie broke another barrier in 1974 as the first female to fly for the airline. That same year, Bill Wilkerson joined the company.
I really came to Piedmont as probably, I would say naive, but a very neutral position. I just expected to be treated fairly. And then from the interview, right on through, all of my exposure to Piedmont was all very positive, I thought. So I just expected that. There was some variation among captains, of course. I think that people on the line may have felt as if you were hired because a federal agency said that you had to hire African Americans, and then you were one of those guys standing on a corner looking like a pilot and was hired. But I think that once you were in the cockpit and you were flying the Piedmont system, which was very demanding, and you were doing the job, those kinds of thoughts dissipated.
Perhaps the most sweeping transformation involved government deregulation of the airline industry to spur competition and reduce subsidies. Initially, management in Winston-Salem was wary.
We originally had serious doubts that deregulation would be the panacea that its supporters predicted.
We always had a fear, I think, really a fear that if we ever let up, or this deregulation would allow the Uniteds and Easterns and the Delta to just come in and cherry pick our system and take our money-making routes away, we'd be the first to go.
One reason for Piedmont's change in attitude was the entry of a new leader. As Mr. Davis neared mandatory retirement age, his search for a successor led him to a lawyer turned airline executive from Eastern Airlines who came to Winston-Salem just as Congress was debating the question of deregulation. Instead of fighting what looked to be inevitable, William R. Howard determined the new way offered opportunity.
Bill Howard convinced Piedmont that this could be a good thing, that Piedmont could actually prosper in a deregulated environment.
The philosophy in the company switched from a standpoint that we are as good as anybody out there, and we can compete. And we had enough history to prove that going into routes against Eastern and several of the other carriers that we could compete. So that's when the philosophy of the company switched to, we were for deregulation.
Deregulation of the airlines by Congress in October of 1978 has had a profound effect on the entire industry. For Piedmont, it has made possible greater expansion in only 3 years' time than we were able to achieve under the original Federal Aviation Act in 30 years.
It turned out that deregulation was one of the best things that ever happened to Piedmont in many ways. They started picking up all the routes that everybody else was abandoning in this rush to try to get in all the prime routes.
Charlotte was the first place we looked at to really establishing a hub. We'd been sort of toying around with making it a hub at that point.
The first year that the Charlotte terminal opened, Piedmont had 100 flights. The next year, 140 flights. And really by the late 80s, more than 400 flights. Just phenomenal growth.
Everybody at Piedmont thought deregulation was going to kill Piedmont. And actually, it was the opposite. It made Piedmont. But it was because our people were willing to really go at it.
I think we all knew we could do it. Financially, would it work? Would it expand? Would it be a profitable venture? You know, that was something that I think we all had confidence it would be, but you don't know until you try it.
When the Charlotte hub was so successful, then Bill Howard said, well, we can go and establish more hubs. We can use a similar strategy with the short flights combined with the long-haul flights.
Piedmont's knack for finding business in places where other airlines didn't see it served them well when the hubs came along. They started their first one in Charlotte and then started one in Baltimore, which at the time, BWI Airport was not a major airport by any means. Then when they started one in Dayton, they were sort of the butt of a lot of jokes within the industry. Dayton was in the Rust Belt. No one was going to serve that market. All the action was in the Southeast and in the West. Well, Piedmont made a great go of it. They were very successful.
The Dayton hub, when we inaugurated that service, there were new flights out of like 5 or 6 cities all at one time. It was a pretty awesome thing to try to do, but we got it done. We had a lot of confidence in ourselves, we had a lot of confidence in the airline and the management, and we had a lot of confidence in personnel. That's what made it work. They were dedicated to doing it, and if you ask them to do a little extra, man, they were just pleased that you asked them.
Everybody felt like they were a piece of all this growth. When special flight attendants or pilots walked through the terminal building, they were not the pilots of a local service carrier. They were the pilots or flight attendants of the fastest growing airline in the United States. So there was a difference in your swagger.
We loved that. Long legs, you know, we hadn't been flying that before, so we got into we became a trunk carrier at that time. We were no longer a small airline. We've got to be a big airline.
We were just living everybody's dream, actually. So it was just a great time to walk around as a Piedmont airline partner.
It was really quite an achievement that Piedmont could go through this change from being a regional to being a major carrier, and at the same time maintain that family atmosphere, but they succeeded in doing that.
Deregulation presented more possibilities than ever imagined in the days of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Dallas, then Denver were added, and ultimately Los Angeles, making Piedmont a coast-to-coast carrier in 1984. But even while expanding, the airline never sacrificed customer satisfaction, as it demonstrated on the first LA flight.
We've advertised this thing as nonstop, and we've got a lot of passengers that thinks it's nonstop.
We didn't have a long-range airplane yet, so we had to stop in I think it was Tulsa, Oklahoma.
If the winds were not really bad, we could sometime make it nonstop. But if the weather was bad in LA and it looked like we had to stop, the pilot would make the announcement that we were going to have to stop for fuel. But the flight attendants would be around in a few minutes and had a present for each one of them. And we passed out $100 bills on the airplane to every passenger on that airplane. And nobody had a problem with stopping.
And when we pulled into LA, we were only a few minutes late. And one passenger said to me, he said, "Man, if you folks do this," he said, "I'll fly with you all the time."
Passengers weren't the only ones rewarded with $100 bills.
Every year for Christmas, Mr. Davis gave every employee a brand new, crisp $100 bill. Now, I know in today's world, that doesn't sound like that much money. It wasn't the money. It was the idea of the gift. And we also, the employees, for all his generosity and what he had done for us, we bought him a SL Mercedes. That's what he meant to all of us. That's how close a knit company we were.
I remember at work one day, one of the supervisors came by and said, "Frank, we're taking a little collection. Mr. Davis is retiring in a couple of months, and we want to think about getting something special for him. Anybody get him a Mercedes-Benz. Now, don't tell anybody. It's top secret, and if everybody would chip in $5 or $10, whatever you'd like to give, I think we're going to give it to him at the Piedmont Olympics. We had the Piedmont Olympics out at Wake Forest. And so we were having to think to get some money to raise for the U.S. Olympic team and just kind of a company thing at the same time. They said, well, that's when that'll be the perfect time to present Mr. Davis with the car. It could have been anything.